Hi, Daryl Bars here, another edition of Liquid Lunch. I have the pleasure of having Blackburn McBride, who's got her third novel. She's published 2 already, and she's a transformational life coach. So, Robin, good to have you.
Thank you, Daryl.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to be here. I want to jump in and say it's actually my first novel. It's my third book.
Third book?
Yes.
But it got published first?
No,
the first one you wrote.
The first one I wrote was a book of poetry, and that was published back in 2002. The second one was a book on self-help. It's called Birdlight, Freeing Your Authentic Creativity. That came out in 2016. This is the novel, The Shining Fragments, which is just out now.
Just out. So let's talk about this then first.
All right.
Okay.
Good.
So what's it about, like Shining Fragments? What does that mean?
Well, The Shining Fragments is a story of a character named Joseph Conlon. Now, I want to begin by saying I actually wrote this book before the book that came out in 2016. There's a bit of a story with that. This book started for me many years ago. It actually started for me right about the time that my poetry book had been published. And so that was about 2002, 2003, in that time period. And at that time in my life, a character came to me. You're a writer, Daryl, so I think you probably relate to this. That, it's that feeling of being ready for a story to come. In fact, making oneself ready for a story to come.
The vessel, okay.
The vessel, exactly. And I was at a point in my life where I was changing the way I was living my life in some fundamental areas. And there was a shift in me, and at that time, I knew that I wanted to write fiction. I had always wanted to write fiction, and this little boy just started speaking to me, whispering to me, wanting his story to be known. He's a boy who comes from Ireland in 1882. I've always been fascinated with Toronto history, so I knew there was no question he's a Toronto boy, but he's from away. And he's an orphan. And so I suppose I'm now in the tradition of writers who write about orphans. There's a beautiful line that I read years ago: "The world is an orphan's home." And I've been searching for the reference ever since.
I can't help you on that one.
Yeah, no, but I think that abandonment is something that many of us navigate in our lives, and that intrigued me. His story intrigued me.
It makes the character stronger if they can get through that.
Well, it makes all of us stronger. And then you look at that, you look at abandonment on any level, at any moment in one's life. It's all about the hero's journey. It's about recognizing that obstacles don't have to be insurmountable. And so that was the journey I was prepared to take. I went over a couple of times to County Armagh in what is now Northern Ireland, and researched the world where Joseph came from, researched how he would have arrived in that time period, and really the bulk of the research was devoted to learning the city of Toronto in the late 19th century.
Right.
Yeah.
So down brickworks, I imagine, areas like that?
It's really interesting that you mentioned the brickworks. I don't actually go there in the novel, but it was certainly in my imagination at the time as a possible setting. The settings of the novel, Union Station is where it starts. In fact, that's where he's left behind. And the Union Station in 1882 is not the building that we have now. It was a beautiful building right on the lake.
Right.
And there were 3 towers, and he sits all day under one of the towers. Anyway, he's taken to the West End, beyond the city in those days, well beyond the city, if you can imagine, as far as Parkdale, which is very much part of Toronto now, but in those days that was really the fringe, out on Humber Bay, even to the west of Parkdale. to a place called Sunnyside, and he is taken to a Catholic orphans home, where he begins his journey of growing up in Toronto. He's age 8, so
okay,
he's there
so
for a while, and then the story follows him back down into the city. I explore the newsboys, becomes a newsboy. He really navigates the streets of Toronto. There was a book I used in the research process that was published in 1898 called Of Toronto the Good. And there's a subtitle which probably isn't immediately going to come to my mind, but the title is a bit ironic because in the day it was written really as an expose on what the city was really like in the late 19th century. So,
which was not that good, probably.
Well, you know, I kind of refrain from the good and bad statements, right? I just really wanted to look at the world from his eyes and, as much as possible, take an unvarnished perspective. He works in the streets selling papers. He works at a mill downtown. Not far from where we had the launch of the book last night at Ben McNally's, right down on Bay Street, this flour mill. Yeah. And ultimately, you know, way back when I was probably beginning to dream this book, which would have been going back farther than 2002, in the 90s, I was actually starting to have thoughts come about this story. I lived in what is now called Cabbagetown, which is a little bit north of the old designated Cabbagetown, which would have been south of Gerrard Street. In any case, when I lived up there, I became very enamored of the Victorian architecture, specifically the stained glass windows in the city's early churches. And this character, Joseph, he is definitely an artist, and he's finding his way as an artist and as a man in that time with his particular set of issues that he has, and really he finds his way into stained glass painting.
Nice.
So yeah, I've had some amazing experiences working on it. You know, I was saying last night at the book launch, it's really a fallacy that a writer would be sitting alone, completely alone, writing a book of this nature. This has been a book that has brought me to community after community after community, and I've had, oh my gosh, I've had so many amazing
encounters with
connections with people. You know, one of them was with Andrew McCausland, whose family is a 5-generation stained glass painting family here in the city. An amazing storyteller, a wonderfully colorful man, and he's one of many people who've, in a sense, had a hand in this, because a creative hand, because they've inspired me. Yeah.
Did you read? It reminds me slightly of Ondaatje's Skin of a Lion, right? In the sense, there's also that, if you remember that, the character
absolutely.
left at Union Station. I think there's
there's a nun. There's Alice Gull at the beginning of that novel. I think that's her name, and that breathtaking scene that Ondaatje writes about the construction of the Prince Edward Viaduct and. Oh gosh, yes. That's going back many years for me now, since I've read that book.
But again, just there was that one little scene too in Union Station with a man who's like standing there, also sort of abandoned, not a child, but doesn't know, and sort of yelling, and then Patrick Lewis's quest to become what he sort of does, similar in a sense to your story.
Oh, very interesting.
With that transformational quest. Because there's so many stories of, you know, what built Toronto, and we don't really know them. Most of our stories are really American stories to some degree. No.
Well, that was one of the pieces of this that really kept my flame of desire burning for this story, was that I wanted to get to know the city. I really wanted to get to know Toronto. I've always had a passion for Toronto. When I was a kid, I mean, when I say Toronto history.
Right.
I remember, I grew up in Etobicoke, and so for me, the allure of the city was always there when I was growing up. I always wanted to be on a subway train coming down into the center, and when I started doing that on my own in my early teens, you know, I never wanted to go back. And probably as soon as I could, I moved down into the inner city, and I've lived in all different neighborhoods in the city. But yeah, that feeling of what was here before, what are the layerings? Now when I go to Etobicoke, I go very nostalgically, and I have a sense of resonance and history there too. When I was growing up there, I always wondered, who are the farmers here? And before that, who are the First Nations people here? In the city, always drawn to the architecture. I worked as a kid at Campbell House. It was my first paying job. I was a tour guide. I think it was 1981. And, I just love the city history.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
A lot there. And interesting about the people. I suppose one of the primary forces motivating this story was an exploration into what is the old country for those of us whose families have been here for generations. And my original concept for the book was that it would be a multi-generational story, and that I would have characters living their lives in different time periods all at once. So getting to your passion on dimensions, that really was the impetus when I started. And in fact, when I began writing the Shining Fragments, in the very rough draft phase of it, I was also writing a contemporary narrative. And these people are linked by blood, but they don't know each other. And so in the early 2000s, that question of being linked by blood and wondering, where did my people come from? Wanting to go simply to that land. There are moments when I've flown into Belfast where I start to cry, which is kind of odd.
Deep roots.
Well, it's interesting too, because I did not write the book as an exploration of my ancestry or my ancestors per se, but I wrote the book about Joseph, but in the course of writing the book, discovered that some of my own ancestors actually came from Armagh. So, yeah.
And is there anything you want to read from it, maybe? Do you want to give us a little taste of what it sounds like? It's up to you.
What I'll do is I'll read from the very beginning.
Okay, all
that
right.
way I'm not really giving anything away.
There you go.
Yeah.
A little teaser.
Mam died on the third day of the crossing. After that, Joseph stayed in the dark, not on the daylit deck where old Kira took Colleen. Even when he tried to make sense of Mam's death, he knew his picture of events had shattered, and he couldn't manage all the pieces. Steerage was dank, and there Joseph found Jerry, who walked with a limp, drawing smoke from a cigarette that fit neatly through a gap beside a gold incisor. Jerry said, "Each card's a force." The Queen of Diamonds was his lady, but the Ace of Hearts was worth more. Watch out for the Ace of Diamonds. Jerry's knack for winning at Maw had paid for the steamer and several bodily repairs. Diamonds were the strongest of all earthly gems. You can cut through glass with a diamond, boy. Slice a mirror into pieces and see your face in every one. Jerry's face was a tapestry of scars that Joseph committed to memory. Other images and events he worked hard not to think about.
Nice. I can see stained glass coming out of that almost, in a sense.
Oh, wow.
With the fragments of glass and the diamond cutting glass and all those things, they just resonate into what the story might become. That's
Wow.
beautiful. It's so different because nowadays, of course, there's no such thing as these kind of long journeys from Europe to Canada. It's an airplane, 5 hours, 6 hours, and that's
Yeah.
it. So it's a different world.
It is a different
So
world.
It's really interesting to delve back into that one and feel what that's like.
Yes, yes. And in reverse, it was interesting going to Ireland or Northern Ireland. When I did, I actually had been attending a conference. I was a teacher, and I'd been invited to attend a conference in Switzerland, and so I chose to take an overland route through Paris for personal reasons,
Why not? Yeah.
and then board board a ferry boat on the coast of France and sail to Ireland. I'd actually been there as a very small child, but I sailed to Ireland. I wanted to feel, that experience of being on the ship and arriving. And one of the interesting features of being in Armagh was being hosted by a beautiful couple who ultimately invited me to stay with them in their home and became my surrogate parents when I was away. But I remember very clearly Anne basically putting her arm around me and welcoming me home, which felt very strangely and beautifully moving to me at that time, as my ancestors had come from there, and yet hundreds of years had passed. So that's something I'm definitely exploring in the books that follow this one.
So continuing. And how was the publishing process here? Like, did it work out right away? Was it long? Well, how did it go?
Well, I want to say, looking back now, I actually celebrate that it didn't work out right away. Of course, at the time, I wanted it to work out right away, and it didn't. And really, because of that, I believe I grew as a person. I had to face some old fears that I'd shied away from earlier in my life. I had to step up and keep moving forward. There were a number of no's from houses when this book first went out, although it had received green lights from some people who read it and really resonated with it and believed in it. That was no guarantee of anything.
Right.
So one of the wonderful silver linings in all of that was that I entered coaching. In fact, I entered a coaching process before the publication adventure, we'll call it. It was part of my call to adventure, actually, was to say yes to coaching. And I'm very glad that I did, because I really believe that if I had not been on the receiving end of coaching, I might have given up. And so, in fact, the book was finished in late 2013, early 2014, and did not go the old conventional route. It went in a different way, and because of the coaching principles that I had been studying, I was able to, in a sense, be the dance partner of this universe and allow that there was another way. In fact, I want to say a better way, that it was coming into form. And in the process of all of that, Daryl, I discovered that I loved the coaching study so much that I wanted to become a coach. So this book has been like Joseph taking me by the hand and saying, follow me, trust me. Not giving up on my dream showed me that. And in fact, now I do have a thriving coaching business and I'm writing. So instead of the either or, it's really been the both and that I have embraced in this new phase. And that's part of what keeps us growing, is just continually moving beyond the comfort zone, continually stepping up and being willing to step into that new version of ourselves, right?
Nice. So what's the next book that you have in your head? You said you can see things brewing. What is?
Well, I have two, actually. Yeah. There's a book that has been coming to me for a little while now, which is a book on healing and really a spiritual journey into healing. So that's a book that I feel very called to explore and to bring into form sooner rather than later. And then, of course, there's the next book in this trilogy.
Okay, so it's a trilogy is going to happen. That's good. You force yourself there. It's good to see it.
So now what I have to do is gain clarity as to which is coming next. But I know one thing for sure, 2019, in part, will be a writing year. It's always a coaching time. I'm always happy to pay this forward and help people. And I will say, in all walks of life, not only writers, but people come and work because of their dream and their hero's journey, and the principles that I use and work with and teach. and support people in are principles that are universally applicable.
Cool. So these two books, one will be nonfiction then?
Yes.
And one will be fiction?
Yes.
And-
But similar to Birdlight, my self-help book, creative self-help book that I brought out a couple of years ago, the nonfiction will, it will be a weave of things. It will likely have poetry in it. It will likely have passages from other writers. I like to, I don't know, you know what? I will wait and see where I'm guided with it, but I know the guidance is coming through pretty strongly, that one will likely be the next one. Yeah.
So you feel very channeled in many ways, that
Yeah.
things are coming through you.
Yeah, I do. I feel that is, for me, and I'm sure for others, you may resonate with this, that's what the writing process has always been for me, is a form of connecting deeply with intuition, with unseen forces, and setting the intention that it be for the highest good of all concerned.
Right. Well, that's beautiful.
Thank
Then
you.
I think we'll maybe end on that. I think that would be a perfect note. We'll look forward to
Thank
the
you.
next in the series. And meanwhile, people, where can they find your book?
They can find this book on Amazon.
Okay.
It's and I believe it'll be in bookstores very soon, if it's not already, but Amazon for
I
sure.
imagine it's at McNally's. If you
It
reckon.
is at
Yeah.
McNally's, yes.
Okay.
Yes. And if anybody wonders, go to my website, robinblackburnmcbride.com,
Right there.
and go to my books section, find fiction, and the information is there.
And if they need life coaching,
Same
they can
place.
get that too.
Yeah, one-stop shop.
Stop shop. That's fantastic.
Good.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much
Thank
for
you,
coming
Daryl.
in.